December 1944. The Hurtgen forest along the German-Belgian border had become hell on earth. American soldiers were dying at a rate of 5,000 men per week in what would later be called one of the bloodiest and most futile battles in US military history. The dense evergreens provided perfect cover for German machine gun nests, and every yard of frozen ground was contested with mortars, artillery, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. But what happened in a small German aid station during one freezing night would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about their enemy. A Nazi doctor sworn to serve the Third Reich would perform an emergency surgery on a critically wounded American paratrooper while bullets tore through the walls around them. This wasn't a propaganda story. This wasn't fiction. This was a moment when the Hippocratic Oath collided with the horrors of war, and one man had to choose between his duty to his Führer and his duty to save a life. By the end of this story, you'll discover why this incredible act of humanity was buried for decades, and why the US military tried to keep it quiet. The Hurtgen Forest Offensive began in September 1944, just 3 months after D-Day. American commanders believed that pushing through this 20-mile stretch of dense woodland would open a direct path to the Rhine River and ultimately to Berlin itself. The forest seemed like a minor obstacle on paper. Intelligence reports suggested the German forces were depleted, disorganized, and ready to collapse. But those reports were catastrophically wrong. The Germans had transformed the Hurtgen into a fortress. They had spent months fortifying every hill, every clearing, every narrow logging road. Concrete bunkers were hidden beneath thick canopies of pine and fir trees. Minefields stretched for miles, many of them designed to detonate at treetop level, sending deadly shrapnel raining down on anyone below. The weather was merciless. Freezing rain turned the ground into a muddy nightmare, and when the temperature dropped, soldiers found themselves fighting frostbite as much as the enemy. Visibility was nearly zero. The thick forest canopy blocked out sunlight even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight that disoriented men and made navigation almost impossible. American soldiers called it the meat grinder. Entire companies would advance into the forest and simply disappear. The trees absorbed the sound of gunfire, making it impossible to tell where shots were coming from. German snipers waited for hours, sometimes days, for the perfect moment to strike. Artillery shells burst in the treetops, creating a deadly phenomenon called tree bursts that multiplied the killing radius of each explosion. Splinters of wood became shrapnel. Branches became flying spears. The forest itself had become a weapon. And yet, despite the horrific casualties, American commanders refused to change strategy. They kept sending wave after wave of young men into the same killing fields, convinced that the next push would break through. The 9,000 square mile forest swallowed divisions whole. The 4th Infantry Division entered the Hurtgen with 14,000 men and left with just 4,000 combat-effective soldiers. The 28th Infantry Division lost more than 6,000 men in just 1 week. Medics couldn't keep up with the wounded. Supply lines were constantly cut by German counterattacks, and in the chaos, something unexpected was about to happen. On the German side of the forest, military doctors were facing their own crisis. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps was stretched beyond its limits. Supplies were running dangerously low. Morphine, plasma, and surgical instruments were being rationed. Field hospitals were overflowing with wounded German soldiers, and the Allies' relentless bombing campaign meant that evacuating the critically injured to rear area hospitals was becoming nearly impossible. Among these overwhelmed doctors was a man named Franz, a 32-year-old surgeon from Bavaria who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht Medical Service in 1942. Franz had never wanted to be a soldier. He had studied medicine in Munich, specializing in trauma surgery, and had dreamed of opening a private practice after the war. But like millions of other Germans, he had no choice. He was assigned to a forward aid station just 2 miles behind the German defensive lines in the Hurtgen forest. His job was to stabilize the wounded long enough to transport them to a proper hospital. But in the winter of 1944, that was becoming impossible. The aid station where Franz worked was nothing more than a reinforced bunker carved into a hillside with dirt walls, a wood-burning stove, and a single operating table made from rough-cut timber. Franz had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Young men with limbs torn off by mines, soldiers with half their faces missing from shrapnel wounds, boys barely 18 years old screaming for their mothers as they bled out on stretchers. And despite his training, despite his skill, there was often nothing he could do. He would hold their hands as they died, whispering lies about how they would be fine, how the pain would stop soon. He had stopped believing in God somewhere around the 1000th death, but he still believed in his oath. He had sworn to heal, not to harm. And on the night of December 18th, 1944, that oath would be tested in a way he never imagined. Because the soldier lying on his operating table, bleeding out from a catastrophic abdominal wound, wasn't wearing a German uniform. He was wearing the olive-drab fatigues of the United States Army's 101st Airborne Division. And outside the bunker, the forest was erupting in gunfire. The American soldier's name was Stephen. He was 23 years old from a small town in Pennsylvania, and he had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He had survived Market Garden. He had survived 2 months in the Hurtgen forest, but his luck had finally run out. A German mortar round had exploded just meters from his foxhole, and a piece of shrapnel the size of a fist had torn through his abdomen, shredding his intestines and severing a major artery. His squad had tried to carry him back to American lines, but they had gotten lost in the darkness and the chaos. Desperate, they had stumbled directly into the German aid station, expecting to be shot on sight. Instead, they found Franz standing in the doorway, covered in blood from a surgery he had just finished, staring at the dying American in disbelief. And in that moment, Franz made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He ordered the German guards to stand down, pointed to his operating table, and said just 2 words in broken English. "Bring him." The German soldiers guarding the aid station couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their doctor, a loyal member of the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, was preparing to operate on an enemy soldier while their own wounded were still waiting for treatment. One of the guards, a hardened sergeant named Klaus, who had fought on the Eastern Front, raised his rifle and demanded an explanation. Franz didn't even look up from his frantic preparations. He was already cutting away Stephen's blood-soaked uniform, exposing the devastating wound that was pumping the American's life out onto the dirt floor. Franz's hands moved with practiced precision, but his voice was ice-cold as he reminded Klaus of the Geneva Convention. Military doctors were obligated to treat wounded combatants regardless of which side they fought for. It wasn't a suggestion. It was international law. And more importantly, Franz added, it was the right thing to do. Klaus lowered his weapon, but the hatred in his eyes remained. He had lost his brother to an American artillery strike just 3 weeks earlier. Watching an enemy receive medical care while German boys died in the forest felt like a betrayal. But orders were orders, and in the Wehrmacht you didn't question a superior officer, even if that officer wore a white coat instead of combat fatigues. Stephen was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness as shock began to shut down his body. His skin had turned a greyish white and his breathing was shallow and erratic. Franz knew the signs. The American had maybe 20 minutes to live, possibly less. The shrapnel had created a massive laceration in his lower intestine, and internal bleeding was filling his abdominal cavity. Without immediate surgery, Stephen would die on that table. But performing abdominal surgery in a bunker with limited supplies, no anesthesia, and no trained surgical assistant was borderline impossible. Franz had morphine, but not enough to put Stephen under completely. He had surgical thread, but it was running low after a day of treating German casualties. He had a scalpel, forceps and clamps, but no proper lighting beyond a handful of oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the operating area. And to make matters exponentially worse, the battle outside was intensifying. American forces were launching a nighttime counterattack, trying to reclaim ground they had lost earlier that day. The bunker shook as artillery rounds landed nearby, sending dirt cascading from the ceiling. Every explosion made the oil lamps flicker and sway, threatening to plunge the entire operation into darkness. Franz called out for assistance, and one of Stephen's own squad members, a young private named Robert, volunteered to help. Robert had no medical training whatsoever. He was a farm kid from Iowa who had been drafted straight out of high school. But he was the only option available. Franz quickly explained what needed to happen. Robert would hold the lamp steady, keep pressure on bleeding vessels when instructed, and hand Franz instruments as needed. The German doctor's English was limited, and Robert spoke no German, so they would have to communicate through gestures and desperate improvisation. Franz administered what little morphine he had directly into Stephen's abdomen, hoping it would dull the worst of the pain. Then he made the first incision. Stephen screamed. The morphine wasn't enough. His body convulsed on the table, and Robert had to physically hold him down while Franz worked. The American's blood was everywhere, coating Franz's hands, soaking into the wooden table, pooling on the floor. Franz worked faster than he had ever worked in his life, his fingers moving through Stephen's abdominal cavity, searching for the source of the bleeding. He found the damaged artery and clamped it shut, but the intestinal damage was worse than he had feared. Multiple perforations, severe contamination. This wasn't just a matter of stopping the bleeding. He would have to remove nearly 18 inches of destroyed intestine and reconnect the healthy sections. Outside, the firefight reached a crescendo. Machine gun fire raked the hillside just above the bunker, and the unmistakable crack of rifle shots echoed through the forest. American and German soldiers were killing each other less than 50 yards away. And here, in this dirt-walled hole in the ground, a Nazi doctor and an American farm boy were fighting together to save a life. Franz didn't think about the politics. He didn't think about Hitler or Roosevelt or why this war was being fought. He thought only about the next suture, the next clamp, the next decision that would determine whether Stephen lived or died. Robert watched in horrified fascination as Franz's blood-covered hands moved with surgical precision, cutting away dead tissue, irrigating the wound with precious sterile water, and carefully stitching the remaining healthy intestine back together. The oil lamps flickered again as another artillery shell landed nearby, this one close enough to knock Robert off balance. One of the lamps fell, shattering on the floor and plunging half the operating area into shadow. Franz didn't stop. He worked by feel now, his fingers reading the tissue like a blind man reading Braille. Then the unthinkable happened. The bunker's entrance exploded inward as a stray American grenade detonated just outside. The blast wave knocked everyone to the ground, extinguished the remaining lamps, and filled the bunker with choking dust and smoke. For several seconds, there was only darkness and the ringing of shell-shocked ears. Franz was the first to recover. He fumbled in the blackness until he found a lamp, relit it with shaking hands, and immediately returned to the table. Stephen was still breathing. Barely. The explosion had torn open one of the sutures Franz had just placed, and fresh blood was welling up from the wound. There was no time left. Franz had to finish the surgery now, or the American would die. His hands moved with desperate speed, resuturing the torn section, closing the abdominal wall layer by layer, and finally stitching the external incision shut. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't textbook. But it was done. Stephen was still alive. The surgery had taken just under 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity. Franz stepped back from the operating table, his entire body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. His uniform was drenched in blood, some of it Stephen's, some of it from the German soldiers he had treated earlier that day. He looked down at the American's pale face and checked for a pulse. It was there, weak, thready, barely perceptible, but present. Stephen had survived the operation, though whether he would survive the night was an entirely different question. The human body could only endure so much trauma, and Stephen had been pushed far beyond normal limits. Franz knew that infection was almost inevitable, given the conditions of the surgery. The bunker was filthy. The instruments had been sterilized as best as possible, but were far from sterile. And Stephen's intestines had been exposed to contamination from the shrapnel wound for hours before Franz had even begun working. In a proper hospital with antibiotics and blood transfusions, the American would have had a fighting chance. Here in this hole in the ground with limited supplies and no way to evacuate him, his odds were terrifyingly slim. Robert stood frozen in the corner, staring at his hands. They were covered in his friend's blood, and he couldn't stop shaking. He had never seen the inside of a human body before. He had never watched someone's organs being cut apart and sewn back together while they screamed in agony. The farm kid from Iowa had grown up butchering hogs and cattle, But nothing had prepared him for this. Franz noticed the young American's distress and placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking in halting English. "Your friend, he's strong, he maybe live." It wasn't much of a comfort, but it was all Franz could offer. Robert nodded numbly, unable to form words. The German doctor then turned to Klaus and the other guards, switching back to German, and gave them explicit instructions. The American was not to be moved. He was not to be interrogated. He was not to be treated as a prisoner of war until he had stabilized. Franz invoked his authority as the senior medical officer present and made it clear that anyone who interfered with the patient's recovery would answer to him personally. Klaus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The sergeant had seen enough death to recognize a miracle when one happened, even if that miracle involved saving an enemy's life. The battle outside had finally begun to quiet down. The American counterattack had been repelled, and an uneasy silence had settled over the forest. Both sides were licking their wounds, counting their dead, and preparing for whatever came next. Inside the bunker, Franz allowed himself a moment to sit down. Every muscle in his body ached. His hands, which had been steady throughout the entire surgery, were now shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline wore off. He had done the impossible. He had performed major abdominal surgery under combat conditions with almost no resources, and his patient was still breathing. But Franz felt no sense of triumph. He felt only a deep, overwhelming exhaustion and a gnawing certainty that this moment would haunt him forever. He had saved an American life, while German soldiers continued to die just meters away. He had prioritized the Hippocratic oath over loyalty to his country, and he knew that decision could be interpreted as treason. If the wrong officer found out about this, Franz could face a court-martial. He could be accused of aiding the enemy. He could be executed. But in that moment, sitting on a wooden crate in a blood-soaked bunker, while the forest outside smoldered with the remnants of battle, Franz realized something profound. He didn't regret his choice. Not for a second. He had joined the medical profession to save lives, not to pick and choose which lives were worth saving based on the color of their uniform. The Nazi ideology that had consumed Germany taught that some human beings were inherently superior to others, that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a character flaw to be purged. Franz had never fully believed those teachings, but he had gone along with them because the alternative was suicide. Tonight, for the first time since the war began, he had acted according to his own moral compass, rather than the Reich's twisted version of morality. And if that made him a traitor in the eyes of the SS or the Gestapo, then so be it. He would rather die a traitor with his conscience intact than live as a loyal servant to a regime that had abandoned its humanity. Stephen regained consciousness briefly around 3 in the morning. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, and he tried to speak. Franz was immediately at his side, gently pushing him back down onto the table. "You stay still," Franz said in his broken English. "You have surgery. You rest now." Stephen's gaze moved slowly around the bunker, taking in the dirt walls, the flickering oil lamps, the German soldiers standing guard at the entrance. Panic began to set in as he realized where he was. He was behind enemy lines, surrounded by men who should have killed him on sight. But then his eyes found Robert, who was sitting nearby with his head in his hands, and Stephen relaxed slightly. If Robert was still alive, then maybe, just maybe, things weren't as bad as they seemed. Franz saw the fear in the American's eyes and did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a tired, sad smile, but it was genuine. "You going to be okay?" Franz said, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. Stephen tried to respond, but the effort was too much. His eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Dawn arrived with a thick fog that rolled through the Hürtgen forest like a grey shroud. The temperature had dropped below freezing during the night, and frost coated every surface inside the bunker. Stephen was still alive, but his condition remained critical. Franz checked on him every 30 minutes throughout the night, monitoring his pulse, his breathing, and watching for signs of fever that would indicate infection had set in. So far, the American's body temperature remained stable, though Franz knew that could change at any moment. The real danger would come in the next 48 to 72 hours. That was when post-surgical infections typically manifested, and without antibiotics, there would be nothing Franz could do except watch his patient die slowly and painfully. The German doctor had used up nearly all of his remaining bandages on Stephen, which meant that when the next wave of German casualties arrived, he would have almost nothing to work with. Klaus had made sure Franz understood the consequences of that decision, reminding him coldly that German soldiers would suffer because he had chosen to waste supplies on an American. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the German defensive positions. Soldiers who had been fighting in the forest for months were stunned to hear that their unit's doctor had performed emergency surgery on an enemy paratrooper. Reactions were mixed. Some saw it as an act of extraordinary humanity, proof that even in the depths of total war, some men still held on to their moral principles. Others viewed it as an outright betrayal, a slap in the face to every German soldier who had died fighting the Americans. A young officer from the propaganda ministry arrived at the bunker just after sunrise, demanding to know why Franz had not reported taking an enemy prisoner. Franz explained that Stephen was not a prisoner in the traditional sense. He was a patient under medical care, and under the Geneva Convention, wounded combatants were to be treated humanely, regardless of nationality. The propaganda officer was unimpressed. He saw an opportunity here, a chance to photograph the American soldier receiving care from a German doctor, proof that the Wehrmacht treated its enemies with honor and dignity. Franz refused categorically. He would not allow his patient to be turned into a propaganda tool. The officer threatened to report Franz's insubordination to higher command, but Franz called his bluff. He knew that the German military was desperate for trained surgeons, and executing or imprisoning one over a political disagreement would be monumentally stupid, even by Nazi standards. The propaganda officer left in a fury, but Franz knew the situation was far from resolved. Stephen's presence in the bunker created an impossible dilemma. The American couldn't be moved, not in his current condition. Any attempt to transport him would almost certainly kill him, but keeping him here indefinitely was equally untenable. The bunker was a forward aid station, not a hospital, and it was only a matter of time before German command ordered Franz to either transfer the American to a POW camp or execute him as a spy. Neither option was acceptable. Franz found himself in an impossible position, trying to protect a patient while navigating the brutal bureaucracy of a military that valued ideology over human life. He considered his options carefully. The American lines were less than 2 miles away, close enough that Stephen's squad might be able to carry him back if given the chance. But attempting to cross no man's land in broad daylight would be suicide. The forest was saturated with German machine gun positions, snipers and minefields. Anyone caught trying to reach American lines would be cut down before they made it 50 yards. Robert had been sitting with Stephen throughout the night, refusing to leave his side. The young private had barely spoken since the surgery, still processing the horror of what he had witnessed, but as morning broke, he finally found his voice. He asked Franz in simple English why he had done it, why risk everything to save an enemy soldier. Franz paused, considering how to explain something that he himself didn't fully understand. He settled on the simplest answer he could give. Because he is human, Franz said. Not American, not enemy. Human. Same as you, same as me. Robert stared at the German doctor for a long moment, trying to reconcile this compassionate man with the image of Nazi soldiers that had been drilled into him during basic training. The propaganda back home painted all Germans as monsters, sadistic killers who took pleasure in cruelty. But here was a man who had risked his career, possibly his life, to uphold an oath that transcended national loyalty. Robert realized in that moment that the world was far more complicated than the simple narratives of good versus evil that he had been taught to believe. By mid-morning, a new crisis emerged. German command had received reports that an American patrol was operating in the area, likely searching for the missing soldiers from Stephen's squad. If that patrol stumbled onto the bunker, a firefight would erupt, and Stephen would almost certainly be killed in the crossfire. Franz made a decision. He gathered Robert and the other 2 American soldiers who had carried Stephen to the bunker and explained that they needed to leave immediately. They would wait until nightfall, And then Franz would personally guide them through a gap in the German defensive line that he knew about from previous evacuations. It was a massive risk. If they were caught, Franz would be executed for treason, and the Americans would be shot as escaping prisoners, but it was the only chance Stephen had of receiving proper medical care and surviving his injuries. Robert protested that Stephen was too weak to be moved, but Franz was firm. Staying here meant certain death, either from infection or from German command's inevitable order to dispose of the American prisoner. Moving meant a chance, however slim, of survival. The choice was clear. Franz spent the rest of the day preparing for the impossible. He fashioned a makeshift stretcher from 2 wooden poles and a salvaged canvas tarp, reinforcing it with rope to ensure it could bear Stephen's weight over rough terrain. He changed the American's bandages, checking the surgical site for any signs of infection. The wound looked surprisingly clean considering the circumstances, but Franz knew that appearances could be deceiving. Internal infections often showed no external symptoms until it was too late. He gave Stephen another small dose of morphine, carefully rationing what little remained of his supply. The American drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to understand what was happening, other times lost in fever dreams where he called out for his mother and begged invisible enemies not to shoot. Franz had seen this pattern countless times before. The body's response to trauma was as much psychological as physical, and Stephen's mind was trying desperately to process an experience that defied rational comprehension. He had been blown apart by German explosives, operated on by a German doctor, and now that same doctor was risking execution to smuggle him back to American lines. None of it made sense, and Stephen's fractured consciousness struggled to reconcile the contradictions. As evening approached, Franz pulled Klaus aside and told him what he planned to do. The veteran sergeant listened in silence, his weathered face betraying no emotion. When Franz finished explaining, Klaus was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He told Franz that he thought the doctor was insane, that this plan would get everyone killed, and that helping the Americans escape was an act of treason that would result in Franz being hanged if discovered. But then Klaus did something unexpected. He offered to help. The sergeant explained that he had a brother-in-law who served in the Gestapo, and if word of this incident reached the wrong ears, Franz would disappear into a concentration camp long before any court-martial could take place. The only way to protect Franz was to make sure the Americans disappeared completely, leaving no evidence that they had ever been at the bunker. Klaus would falsify the medical logs, claiming that the supplies Franz had used were consumed treating German casualties. He would order the guards to remain silent about what they had witnessed, threatening them with transfer to a penal battalion on the Eastern Front if they talked. And he would personally stand watch while Franz led the Americans through the gap in the defensive line. Klaus made it clear that he wasn't doing this out of sympathy for the enemy. He was doing it because Franz was the best surgeon their unit had, and losing him would mean more German soldiers dying needlessly in the weeks ahead. The plan was set for 2200 hours, when the shift change would create a brief window of reduced vigilance along the German perimeter. Franz used the remaining daylight to drill Robert and the other Americans on exactly what would happen. They would move in complete silence, single file, with Franz leading the way. If they encountered a German patrol, they were not to fight. They were to freeze in place and let Franz do the talking. He would claim he was evacuating wounded from a forward position and hope his medical credentials would be enough to avoid questions. It was a thin cover story, one that would collapse under any serious scrutiny, but it was all they had. Franz also warned them about the minefields. The Germans had sown thousands of anti-personnel mines throughout the forest, many of them designed to maim rather than kill. Stepping on one wouldn't just cost you your leg. The explosion would alert every German position within half a mile, bringing down machine gun fire and artillery on their location within seconds. They would have to follow Franz's footsteps exactly, placing their boots precisely where he placed his, deviating not even an inch from the path he chose. Stephen regained full consciousness around 1900 hours, just 3 hours before they were scheduled to move. Franz knelt beside the stretcher and explained the situation in slow, careful English. They were going to try to get him back to American lines tonight. It would be dangerous, probably the most dangerous thing any of them had ever attempted. Stephen would need to remain completely silent no matter how much pain he was in. Any sound could give away their position and get everyone killed. Stephen listened, his face pale but his eyes clear and focused. He understood the stakes. He also understood that Franz was putting his own life on the line for someone he had every reason to hate. Stephen tried to thank him, but Franz cut him off with a sharp gesture. There was no time for sentimentality. They needed to focus on survival. Franz checked the morphine levels in Stephen's system and made a difficult decision. He couldn't give the American any more painkiller. Too much morphine would suppress his breathing and potentially kill him, especially given his weakened state. Stephen would have to endure the journey in significant pain, gritting his teeth and suffering in silence while being carried through a frozen forest filled with enemy soldiers. At 21:45 hours, Franz made his final preparations. He stuffed his medical bag with the few remaining supplies he thought might be useful, including bandages, surgical thread, and a small bottle of schnapps that could serve as both disinfectant and painkiller if needed. He changed into a clean uniform, reasoning that a blood-soaked doctor would attract unwanted attention. Klaus had already spoken to the guards, ensuring that the men on duty during the shift change were ones who could be trusted to look the other way. At precisely 2200 hours, Franz gave the signal. Robert and the other Americans lifted Stephen's stretcher, trying to ignore the muffled groan of pain that escaped their friend's lips. Franz led them out of the bunker and into the freezing December night. The forest was pitch black, the thick canopy blocking out even the faint starlight. They moved slowly, feeling their way forward, every footstep a gamble that could end in sudden death. Behind them, Klaus watched from the bunker entrance, smoking a cigarette and wondering if he would ever see the doctor again. The forest at night was a world of absolute terror. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. The crunch of frozen leaves underfoot seemed loud enough to wake the dead. The stretcher creaked with each step, and Stephen's labored breathing cut through the silence like a saw blade. Franz moved with agonizing slowness, testing each footfall before committing his weight, searching with his hands for the telltale wires that indicated mines. He had memorized this route during previous medical evacuations, running supplies between the bunker and a field hospital 3 miles to the rear. But those trips had been made in daylight, with clear visibility and no enemy soldiers to worry about. Now, in complete darkness with 4 Americans depending on him, every meter felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. They had covered barely 200 yards when Franz suddenly froze, his hand shooting up in a signal to stop. Voices, German voices. Less than 30 yards to their left, a patrol was moving through the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Franz and the Americans dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the frozen earth, praying that the undergrowth would hide them. Stephen bit down on a piece of leather Franz had given him, fighting the urge to cry out, as the impact of hitting the ground sent waves of agony through his torn abdomen. The German patrol moved closer. Franz could hear their conversation clearly now. They were complaining about the cold, about the lack of supplies, about rumors that American reinforcements were massing for another offensive. One of the soldiers was talking about his girlfriend back in Munich, wondering if she was still waiting for him, or if she had moved on to someone who wasn't stuck in this frozen hell. The patrol passed within 15 yards of where Franz and the Americans lay hidden, close enough that Franz could smell the tobacco smoke from their cigarettes. Time seemed to stop. Every second felt like an hour. Robert was holding his breath, his face pressed against the dirt, certain that they were about to be discovered. But the German soldiers never looked in their direction. They were focused on their own misery, on getting through their patrol route as quickly as possible, so they could return to whatever warmth they could find. After what felt like an eternity, the voices faded into the distance. Franz waited a full 5 minutes before signaling that it was safe to move again. When they lifted Stephen's stretcher, the American's face was grey with pain, and his bandages were seeping blood. The impact of dropping to the ground had torn open one of the internal sutures. Franz could see it in the way Stephen's abdomen had begun to swell, a telltale sign of internal bleeding. They were running out of time. Franz increased their pace, abandoning caution in favor of speed. They needed to reach American lines before Stephen bled out, even if that meant taking risks with the minefields. He led them down a narrow ravine that offered some cover from observation, but was treacherous in the darkness. Twice, one of the Americans carrying the stretcher stumbled on hidden roots, nearly dropping Stephen. Each time, Franz had to physically grab the stretcher to keep it level, whispering harsh commands in German-accented English to keep moving, keep going, don't stop. They were making too much noise now, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Franz knew that if another German patrol heard them, there would be no talking their way out of it. He would be shot as a deserter, and the Americans would be gunned down before they could surrender. But there was no other choice. Stephen's life was measured in minutes now, not hours. They had to reach American lines immediately, or all of this, the surgery, the risk, the impossible journey through enemy territory, would be for nothing. Franz found himself praying for the first time in years, begging a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore to just let them make it a little farther. They crossed into no man's land around 23:30 hours. This was the most dangerous part of the journey, a stretch of open ground roughly 400 yards wide, where both German and American forces had clear fields of fire. During daylight, crossing this area was suicide. Snipers from both sides would compete to see who could kill you first. At night, it was only slightly less deadly. Machine gunners on both sides were trained to fire on any movement they detected, asking questions later if at all. Franz knew they had one advantage. The Americans would be expecting German patrols to approach from the east, not from directly in front of their positions. If Franz could get close enough to shout a warning before the Americans opened fire, they might survive. He told Robert and the others to drape a white bandage over the stretcher, the closest thing they had to a flag of surrender. Then they stepped out of the tree line and into the open. The ground here was churned mud, frozen solid and littered with shell craters. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. Bodies from previous assaults lay where they had fallen, German and American alike, frozen into grotesque sculptures by the winter cold. Franz tried not to look at them as he navigated between the craters, focusing only on the tree line ahead, where American positions should be. They were halfway across when the first shot rang out. A rifle round cracked past Franz's head, missing by inches. Then another and another. The Americans had spotted them and were opening fire. Franz screamed at the top of his lungs in English, shouting that they were friendlies, that they had wounded, that they needed help. But his voice was lost in the chaos. More shots rang out, kicking up frozen dirt around their feet. Robert was yelling too, trying to identify himself, screaming his unit designation and rank. One of the bullets struck the stretcher, splintering the wooden pole and nearly causing them to drop Stephen. Franz threw himself forward, waving his arms, still shouting, begging them to stop shooting. And then, miraculously, the firing ceased. A voice called out from the American lines, demanding they advance slowly with their hands up. Franz complied, his heart hammering in his chest. They had made it. Against all odds, they had crossed the most heavily contested piece of real estate in Western Europe, and survived. Now they just had to pray the Americans didn't shoot them anyway. American soldiers emerged from their foxholes with weapons raised, moving cautiously toward the group in no man's land. Franz kept his hands high above his head, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The soldiers were young, most of them barely out of their teens, their faces hard with suspicion and fear. A lieutenant approached first, his Thompson submachine gun aimed directly at Franz's chest. He barked questions in rapid English, demanding to know who they were and what the hell they were doing out here. Robert answered for them, explaining that they were from the 101st Airborne, that their friend had been badly wounded, and that this German doctor had saved his life and helped them escape. The lieutenant's expression shifted from hostility to confusion. He looked at Franz, then at Stephen lying pale and unconscious on the stretcher, then back at Franz. Nothing about this situation made sense. Enemy doctors didn't risk their lives to save American soldiers. Enemy doctors didn't guide their patients through minefields and across no man's land. This had to be some kind of trick, a German infiltration attempt or a setup for an ambush. The lieutenant ordered his men to search Franz thoroughly, strip him of anything that could be a weapon, and bind his hands behind his back. Franz didn't resist. He understood the American skepticism, and he knew that protesting would only make things worse. They carried Stephen back to the American lines, and within minutes he was surrounded by US Army medics who immediately began working to stabilize him. One of the medics, a grizzled staff sergeant named Martinez who had been patching up wounded soldiers since North Africa, examined Stephen's surgical site and let out a low whistle of disbelief. Someone had performed a full intestinal resection under field conditions, and from what Martinez could see, they had done it extraordinarily well. The suturing was precise, the wound margins were clean, and despite the internal bleeding that had started during the escape, the primary surgical repair was holding. Martinez looked up at Franz, who was kneeling nearby with his hands still bound, and asked in broken German where he had learned to operate like that. Franz replied in English that he had trained at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich before the war, that he had specialized in trauma surgery, and that he had performed this particular procedure dozens of times on German soldiers. Martinez nodded slowly, beginning to understand. This wasn't some sadistic Nazi playing games. This was a real doctor who had risked everything to honor his oath. The American medic ordered the soldiers guarding Franz to untie him and bring him over to the medical station. If this German wanted to help, Martinez was going to put him to work. For the next 3 hours, Franz worked alongside American medics, treating wounded soldiers who had been brought in from the latest assault on German positions. He set broken bones, sutured lacerations, and helped Martinez perform an emergency amputation on a sergeant whose leg had been shredded by a mine. The American medical personnel watched him with a mixture of awe and suspicion, still unable to fully process what was happening. Here was an enemy combatant, a member of the Wehrmacht, working to save American lives with the same dedication he had shown saving Stephen. Some of the wounded soldiers refused his help at first, demanding to be treated by American doctors instead. But Martinez shut down those protests immediately. He didn't care what uniform Franz wore. The man was a skilled surgeon, and they needed every skilled hand they could get. By dawn, Franz had helped save the lives of 6 American soldiers, and even the most skeptical members of the unit had begun to accept his presence. Word spread quickly through the American lines about the German doctor who had defected to save a wounded paratrooper, and soldiers began stopping by the medical station just to get a look at him. But Franz's situation remained precarious. He was technically a prisoner of war now, subject to interrogation and indefinite detention. A military intelligence officer arrived at the medical station around 0700 hours, demanding to question Franz about German defensive positions, troop strengths, and strategic plans. Franz refused to answer. He explained that he was a doctor, not a combat soldier, and that he had no knowledge of military operations beyond what was necessary to perform his medical duties. More importantly, he made it clear that he had not defected. He had not abandoned his post or deserted the Wehrmacht. He had simply fulfilled his obligation under the Geneva Convention to ensure his patient received proper medical care. The intelligence officer was furious, accusing Franz of being uncooperative and threatening him with imprisonment. But Martinez intervened, arguing that Franz had proven his good faith by working tirelessly to save American lives, and that harassing him would be both ungrateful and counterproductive. The argument escalated until a full colonel arrived to sort out the situation. The colonel listened to both sides, examined Stephen's medical records, and interviewed several of the soldiers Franz had treated. Then he made a decision that would change everything. The colonel declared that Franz would be classified as a protected person under the Geneva Convention, not as a standard prisoner of war. He would be housed in a secure but comfortable location, given access to medical supplies, and allowed to continue practicing medicine under American supervision. In exchange, Franz would provide medical care to both American and German wounded, maintaining strict neutrality and refusing to participate in any intelligence-gathering activities. It was an unprecedented arrangement, one that bent the rules of military protocol almost to the breaking point. But the colonel recognized that Franz represented something rare and valuable, a man who had chosen humanity over ideology, who had risked his life to uphold principles that transcended national loyalty. Losing that example to bureaucratic pettiness would be a waste. Franz accepted the terms without hesitation. He had crossed a line the moment he decided to operate on Stephen, and he knew there was no going back to his old life. The Wehrmacht would consider him a traitor. The Nazi Party would brand him an enemy of the state. His family in Bavaria would likely face persecution because of his actions. But Franz had made his choice, and he would live with the consequences. Stephen survived. Against every reasonable medical prediction, the young paratrooper from Pennsylvania pulled through. The internal bleeding that had started during the escape was brought under control by American surgeons at a field hospital 15 miles behind the lines. They reopened Franz's original incision, repaired the damaged suture, and marveled at the quality of the emergency surgery that had been performed in that dirt bunker. The lead surgeon, a captain from Massachusetts General Hospital, wrote a detailed report describing Franz's work as extraordinary under impossible circumstances, and recommending that the German doctor be recognized for his life-saving actions. Stephen spent 6 weeks recovering in a military hospital in Paris before being shipped back to the United States. His war was over. The wound would leave him with chronic pain for the rest of his life, and he would never fully regain the strength he had before that mortar round tore through his abdomen. But he was alive, and he knew exactly who to thank for that. Before leaving Europe, Stephen made a promise to himself. If he ever got the chance, he would find Franz after the war and repay the debt he owed. He had no idea how difficult that promise would be to keep. Franz remained with American forces for the rest of the war, working in field hospitals and aid stations as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. He treated thousands of wounded soldiers, both American and German, maintaining the strict neutrality he had promised. He never shared intelligence, never revealed German defensive positions, and never compromised his medical ethics. The American soldiers who worked alongside him developed a deep respect for the quiet German doctor, who seemed to care nothing for politics or nationalism, only for saving lives. Some tried to befriend him, to draw him into conversations about why he had made the choices he did. Franz rarely engaged with these attempts. He was polite but distant, focused entirely on his work. The truth was that Franz was struggling with profound guilt. Every German soldier he treated represented a comrade he had potentially betrayed. Every American soldier he saved was another reminder that he had chosen the enemy over his own countrymen. He understood intellectually that his actions had been morally correct, that saving Stephen's life had been the right thing to do. But emotionally he felt like a traitor. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart, and he dealt with it the only way he knew how, by working himself to exhaustion and avoiding any reflection on the deeper meaning of his choices. When the war ended in May 1945, Franz found himself in an impossible situation. He couldn't return to Germany. The Nazi regime had collapsed, but the chaos that followed was almost as dangerous. Former Wehrmacht soldiers were being rounded up by Soviet forces in the eastern zones, and many were never heard from again. The western zones were safer, but Franz knew that his actions during the war had been documented in American military records. If word got out that he had helped American soldiers escape, he could be targeted by Nazi loyalists seeking revenge. The US Army offered him a choice. He could be repatriated to Germany and take his chances, or he could emigrate to the United States under a special program designed to recruit valuable foreign nationals. The program was primarily aimed at scientists and engineers, but exceptions could be made for individuals with unique skills or circumstances. Franz qualified on both counts. He was a highly trained trauma surgeon, and his story represented exactly the kind of propaganda victory the United States wanted to showcase in the post-war period. A Nazi doctor who had rejected Hitler's ideology to save an American life was a powerful narrative, one that could be used to demonstrate the moral superiority of American values. Franz chose to emigrate, but not for the reasons the US government assumed. He didn't come to America seeking freedom or opportunity or a fresh start. He came because he had nowhere else to go. His family in Bavaria had disowned him after learning of his actions. His medical credentials had been revoked by German authorities who considered him a collaborator. He was a man without a country, caught between two worlds and fully accepted by neither. The American immigration officials processed his paperwork with remarkable speed, eager to complete the formalities before anyone in Congress could raise objections to bringing a former Wehrmacht officer into the United States. Franz arrived in New York in September 1945, carrying a single suitcase containing his medical instruments and a few changes of clothes. He had no money, no connections, and no clear plan for his future. What he did have was a letter of recommendation from the U.S. Army Medical Corps describing his exceptional surgical skills and his heroic actions in the Hurtgen Forest. That letter would open doors, but it would also ensure that Franz could never escape the shadow of that December night in 1944. The American media discovered Franz's story within weeks of his arrival. A reporter from Life magazine heard rumors about a German doctor who had saved an American paratrooper and tracked Franz down to the boarding house where he was staying in Brooklyn. The resulting article, published in November 1945, was a sensation. It portrayed Franz as a hero who had risked everything to uphold the Hippocratic Oath, a man who had chosen humanity over hatred in the darkest hours of the war. The story was accompanied by photographs of Franz working in an American field hospital and a dramatic recreation of the surgery in the bunker. Overnight, Franz became a minor celebrity. He received hundreds of letters from Americans thanking him for his service, offering him jobs and inviting him to speak at churches and community organizations. But Franz hated the attention. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a propaganda tool. He had simply tried to do his job under impossible circumstances, and now he was being paraded around as proof of American exceptionalism. The irony was not lost on him. Franz eventually settled in a small town in upstate New York, where he took a position as a general surgeon at a community hospital. He chose the location specifically because it was remote, far from the media attention that had plagued him in New York City. The hospital administrators knew his story, but they agreed to keep it quiet in exchange for his commitment to serve the rural community that desperately needed medical care. Franz threw himself into his work with the same intensity he had shown during the war. He performed surgeries, delivered babies, treated farm accidents, and worked emergency room shifts that sometimes lasted 36 hours straight. His colleagues noticed that he never talked about his past, never mentioned Germany or the war, and seemed determined to erase any connection to the person he had been. When patients asked about his accent, he would deflect with vague answers about having grown up in Europe. When local veterans organizations invited him to speak at Memorial Day or Veterans Day events, he politely declined. Franz wanted nothing more than to disappear into anonymity, to live out his days as just another small-town doctor. But the past had other plans. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Stephen finally tracked him down. The reunion was awkward and emotional. Stephen had spent years searching for the German doctor who had saved his life, writing letters to the army, contacting veterans organizations, and following every lead he could find. When he finally located Franz in that small New York town, he drove 12 hours straight to meet him. Franz was stunned to see the young paratrooper standing in his office, now a husband and father working as a high school teacher in Pennsylvania. Stephen had brought his wife and 2 young children, wanting them to meet the man who had made their family possible. He tried to thank Franz, to express the gratitude that had been building inside him for 7 years, but Franz cut him off. The German doctor insisted that he had simply done his duty, nothing more, and that no thanks were necessary, but Stephen wouldn't accept that. He told Franz that what he had done in that bunker went far beyond duty. He had risked his life, his career, and his freedom to save an enemy soldier. That wasn't duty. That was heroism. Franz listened in silence, his face betraying no emotion, and when Stephen finished speaking, he simply said that he was glad Stephen had survived and wished him well. Then he returned to his work, leaving Stephen standing in the hallway, realizing that the man he had come to thank wanted nothing to do with gratitude or recognition. But Stephen refused to let the story die. He began speaking at schools and veterans events, telling audiences about the night a Nazi doctor had saved his life. He wrote articles for veterans magazines and gave interviews to local newspapers. His goal was simple. He wanted people to know that even in the worst circumstances, even in the middle of total war between ideological enemies, humanity could still prevail. Franz's story proved that individuals could rise above the hatred and propaganda that defined their nations, that moral courage was possible even when it meant betraying everything you had been taught to believe. Stephen's speaking engagements attracted attention, and eventually the story reached national media again. Television producers wanted to create documentaries, publishers wanted to commission books, Hollywood studios inquired about film rights, and every single time Franz refused to participate, he sent stern letters to journalists demanding they leave him alone. He threatened legal action against anyone who used his name without permission. He wanted no part of the mythology that was being constructed around that night in December 1944. The reason for Franz's refusal became clear years later, after his death in 1978. Among his personal papers, his executors found a journal he had kept since emigrating to America. The entries revealed a man tormented by guilt and doubt, constantly questioning whether he had made the right choice. Franz wrote about the German soldiers who had died in the Hurtgen forest while he was using precious medical supplies on an American. He wrote about the families in Bavaria who had lost sons and brothers and fathers, and how his decision to help the enemy had dishonored their sacrifices. He wrote about the nightmares that plagued him, dreams where Klaus and the other German soldiers from his unit confronted him, asking why their lives had been worth less than Stephen's. Franz understood that from an abstract moral standpoint, his actions had been correct. All human life has equal value, and a doctor's duty is to heal regardless of nationality. But on a personal, emotional level, he could never reconcile the fact that his heroism had come at the cost of his loyalty to men who had trusted him, served alongside him, and depended on him. The journal made it clear that Franz had never viewed himself as a hero. He saw himself as a traitor who had happened to save one life while potentially costing others. The journal also revealed something even more troubling. Franz had tried multiple times to return to Germany after the war to reconnect with his family, but each attempt had ended in failure. His parents had refused to see him, considering his actions an unforgivable betrayal of the fatherland. His younger brother, who had served in the SS and survived the war, had sent him a single letter calling him a disgrace and demanding he never contact the family again. Franz had died alone in his small New York apartment, estranged from his homeland, haunted by the choices he had made, and convinced that history would judge him not as a hero, but as a coward who had chosen the easy path of moral righteousness over the hard path of loyalty. The irony was devastating. The Americans saw him as a symbol of humanity triumphing over evil. The Germans saw him as a traitor, and Franz saw himself as neither, just a doctor who had tried to do his job and had been destroyed by the consequences. His story wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a tragedy about the impossible choices war forces on ordinary people, and the lifelong burden those choices create. Stephen attended Franz's funeral in 1978, one of only a handful of mourners present. The small-town doctor who had saved his life 34 years earlier had died quietly, without family, without fanfare, and without ever accepting the recognition he deserved. Stephen stood at the graveside and wept, not just for the loss of the man who had given him a second chance at life, but for the profound injustice of Franz's story. Here was someone who had embodied the very best of human nature, who had risked everything to uphold principles that transcended war and nationalism, and he had spent his entire post-war life in isolation and guilt. Stephen realized that the world had failed Franz. The Americans had used him as propaganda, celebrating his heroism while ignoring his pain. The Germans had branded him a traitor, refusing to acknowledge that his actions represented a higher form of patriotism than blind loyalty to a genocidal regime. And Franz himself had been unable to forgive himself, trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination that no amount of good works could break. After the funeral, Stephen made one final promise. He would continue telling Franz's story, not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a complex exploration of the moral costs of doing the right thing in impossible circumstances. The full truth about that night in the Hurtgen forest didn't emerge until the 1990s, when classified military documents from World War II were finally declassified and opened to researchers. Historians discovered that Franz's story was far from unique. There had been dozens, possibly hundreds, of similar incidents throughout the war where enemy doctors had treated wounded soldiers from the opposing side. But almost all of these cases had been suppressed by military authorities on both sides. The US Army had been reluctant to publicize stories of German humanity because it complicated the narrative of total evil that justified the massive bombing campaigns against civilian targets. The German military had covered up such incidents to avoid giving ammunition to those who questioned the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and merciless warfare. Franz's case had only become public because Stephen had refused to let it be forgotten, and even then, the full complexity of the story had been sanitized for public consumption. The propaganda version presented Franz as a hero who had rejected Nazism. The reality was far more nuanced. Franz had never rejected Nazi ideology in any formal sense. He had simply prioritized his medical oath over political loyalty in one specific moment, and that choice had destroyed his life. Modern historians studying the Hurtgen Forest campaign now recognize Franz's surgery as one of the most remarkable medical achievements of World War II. Performing a successful intestinal resection under those conditions, with no anesthesia, minimal supplies, and active combat happening overhead, required skill that bordered on miraculous. Medical schools now use Franz's case as a teaching example of extreme crisis medicine, though few students learn about the personal cost he paid for that achievement. The bunker where the surgery took place was destroyed by artillery fire in January 1945, and its exact location has been lost to history. The Hurtgen forest itself has been reforested, and today it's a quiet woodland where hikers walk trails unaware that they're crossing ground where thousands died in one of the most senseless battles of the war. There are memorials to American and German soldiers who fought there, but there is no memorial to Franz. His name appears in a few historical footnotes, in scholarly articles about medical ethics during wartime, and in the records of the small-town New York hospital where he worked for 26 years. That's the extent of his legacy. Stephen lived until 2006, dying at the age of 84, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who existed only because a German doctor had refused to let ideology override his humanity. In his final years, Stephen gave a series of videotaped interviews about his experiences in World War II, and he spent a significant portion of those interviews talking about Franz. He described the surgery, the escape through no man's land, and the complex man who had saved his life. But he also talked about something he had discovered in Franz's journal after the doctor's death, something that changed his entire understanding of that night. Franz had written that saving Stephen hadn't been a moment of moral clarity or heroic defiance. It had been pure reflex, the automatic response of a trained surgeon seeing a patient who needed help. Franz hadn't decided to save Stephen. He had simply seen a human being dying and done what his training demanded. The heroism, if there was any, had come later, in the decision to help Stephen escape even though it meant betraying his comrades and his country. And that decision, Franz wrote, had haunted him every day for the rest of his life. The story of the Nazi doctor who operated on an American soldier under fire challenges everything we think we know about war, morality, and human nature. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the men who served in armies we now regard as evil, and it raises questions about whether individual acts of decency can redeem participation in systemic atrocities. Franz never claimed his actions made up for serving in Hitler's military. He never tried to position himself as one of the good Germans who had resisted the regime. He had simply been a doctor trying to do his job, and the consequences of that job had destroyed him. His story was buried for decades because it didn't fit the simple narratives that societies use to process the trauma of war. We want our enemies to be purely evil and our heroes to be purely good, and Franz was neither. He was a flawed, complicated human being who made one extraordinary choice and paid for it with a lifetime of guilt, isolation, and regret. That's the story they didn't want you to know, not because it's secret, but because it's true. And the truth is rarely as simple or satisfying as we want it to be. Franz saved Stephen's life in that bunker, but in doing so, he destroyed his own. And the question that haunts his legacy is whether that trade was worth it. Stephen believed it was, but Franz never did.